Hello YouTubers, this is Corbyn Dallas. On today's episode, I'm going to be interviewing Jordan, and he's going to be talking about the ketogenic diet. Jordan, thank you very much for coming.
Hey, it's great to be here, Corey.
Excellent. So what is the ketogenic diet?
Yeah, so the ketogenic diet is essentially a way of changing how we partition fuel. So simply kind of stated, it's a way of utilizing fat as a source of energy opposed to the more traditional means, which is through carbohydrate consumption.
So Jordan, typically Americans will follow the Target diet, or Canadians will follow the Canada's Food Guide. Where does the carbohydrate, fat, and protein intake end up with regards to the ketogenic diet?
Yeah, so when it comes to the ketogenic diet, we do see a difference. So in the standard American diet as well as the Canadian Food Guide recommendations, we're going to see a higher level of carbohydrate. Essentially what's happening within the ketogenic diet is we have a switch. So predominantly we're going to consume a greater amount of fat. Now we want those to come from good sources, which we can get into. Predominantly monounsaturated fats are going to be key. So you're looking at more like your oils, olive oil, avocado oil. Saturated fat is good. Coconut oil is a good example. Animal fats is something where we're also going to get our fats through, but we want to try to limit our intake of polyunsaturated fats, so those vegetable oils. We're going to predominantly eat fat, so it's going to look like if we're following a real true ketogenic diet, it's going to be upwards of 80%, and we're going to look at about 15% from protein and 5% from carbohydrate. Most people, however, would benefit from following something more like a modified ketogenic diet. So we're going to reduce the fat a little bit. It's going to fall in and around 60%. We're going to increase the protein up to about 25 to compensate for our activity and our need for protein. And we're still going to keep the carbohydrate relatively low. And when we consume carbohydrate, at least in my experience, we focus more on our vegetables, our more complex carbohydrate. And we can eat a good amount of those and eat those with fat and still stay within the markers that we're trying to achieve. We find in following this sort of a diet that we actually require less protein because the ketogenic diet is protein sparing. So essentially we're going to rely on the fat as our fuel source. We're not in jeopardy of relying on our protein in the absence of a carbohydrate, as an example. If we don't have enough carbohydrate in our diet, our body's going to start to break down its amino acid. So it's protein sparing. We can get away with eating a lot less. And if we eat too much, we actually see something called glyconeogenesis, which is the breakdown and conversion of protein into glucose. And that will actually hinder our ability to stay in ketosis.
We can still have carbohydrates in the form of fruits and vegetables, but we're avoiding the traditional carbohydrates like potatoes, pasta, and rice. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that would be accurate. I would say with fruits, we would want to still look at the overall consumption. We would want to keep it moderate. We would want to maybe look at when we time that consumption, and we may want to stick to some of the items more like our berries with our higher antioxidant contents. But for the most part, you're correct. We're really trying to avoid those refined sugars. We're obviously eliminating processed food. We're just trying to eat real food, and we're trying to eat quality types of fat, and we're obviously trying to get fattier cuts of meat to avoid that gluconeogenesis. But bang on. We obviously need to consume high amounts of vegetables. We need to get our minerals. We need to get our vitamins. So I wouldn't really look at restricting those. We can get into testing, which is a great way to determine our tolerance to carbohydrates, so how much we can consume while still staying into ketosis.
How do I know if I'm actually in a state of ketosis when I'm training or from day-to-day living?
Yeah, there's a few different ways. So is through the strips. And those are used essentially with urination. So we would urinate on a strip, and it would indicate the amount of ketones that we have in our urine, so essentially how much we're spilling out. Now, the only problem with that is as time goes on, we're going to register lower numbers, and that doesn't actually reflect well, because it'll reflect that essentially we're in a lower level of ketosis, but all that's happening is we're now utilizing those ketones more effectively. So we're actually in a heightened state of ketosis, but it's not registering in the way that we'd like. Another way would be through breath. So there's machines out there, Ketonics is one, where you blow into it and it will do it through breath. And then the most reliable one in terms of measuring is through blood. So for myself as an example, I would use a Precision Neo Extra, and it's used in a way like a diabetic would do glucose. So you would purchase a ketone strip, and postprandial, so after a meal, whether it be an hour, whether it be 2 hours. And this can be done also in the morning in a fasted state, and it can be done before you go to bed. We would use the lancer and we would prick, and then it's measuring the beta-hydroxybutyrate level in the blood. So we would know we're in ketosis if we're able to measure 0.5, and that would be the most minimal range. But I'd say anything over 1 is where you really kind of maybe start to feel the difference a little bit. And in my experience, when I wake up, I'll be at a lower marker, and by the end of the day, it would end up being kind of more my highest reading, or it would depend on maybe what I had consumed. If I ate a bolus of fat, then generally, I might hit into a range of 2 millimolar per milliliter. So the best way would be through testing, and my recommendation would be through the blood. And it's just testing. It's seeing how your body's responding to different foods, and doing it at different points in the day. So in the morning when we wake up and we're fasted, throughout the day, after meals, perhaps even after exercise, to see how your body's responded, and then in the evening before we go to bed. We can get into some great experimentation to see how much we can tolerate, so how much carbohydrate I can perhaps take in while still staying in a state of ketosis. Yeah, so the ketogenic diet has been around probably ever since the existence of man. We can look way back, and there would have been times where there would have been feast and famine, and essentially one slips into ketosis once their body no longer has glucose. So once we've depleted that, it's essentially a survival mechanism. So basically our body will shift, it'll start to break down fat as fuel, just so that we can survive, that we can function, so that we can still sustain life. And if we look at certain populations, a good example would be the Inuit, right? So being periods in the winter where they're unable to harvest or to grow, to forage different types of foods that aren't available during that time, they would have relied more on something like seal meat, whale blubber, and it would have been exogenous consumed fat sources. But that would be an example of a population. If we look at application, it was found out early in the 20th century that certain populations with certain illnesses or diseases, and the one that comes to mind that's key is seizures. So people who suffered from seizures, it was found that if they removed glucose from the diet and we shifted them into a state of ketosis, essentially what would occur is the seizures would subside, or in some cases they would eliminate altogether. So in terms of how it's used medically, it would be used to treat drug-resistant seizures, so people with epilepsy.
Why has it gained so much popularity lately?
Yeah, so I think one of the main reasons is people are tired of essentially a system that's not working for them. So I'm not saying that the ketogenic diet is the only way, because I really, to achieve a specific outcome, right? Predominantly people are using it today for weight loss, and some athletes are using it as well, as you mentioned. It's essentially a tool from my perspective. So essentially people are using it because the processes they were following previously, they may not have been getting the results they were looking for. So I'm specifically speaking in regards to body composition. So, one of the problems that we see is overconsumption relative to energy expenditure. that cause a host of problems over time. If we remove carbohydrate, or if we limit them to a specific level, depending upon how active an individual is, we can regulate blood sugar, and essentially within that process we see people developing an ability to start to utilize more fat as fuel, especially if we start to add in fasting, and we start relying on the bodies internally to break down and to use the fat or the ketone bodies that are produced. So I think from that perspective, people are seeing a change in body composition. So it might not be directly related in the way that we would think. Perhaps we could, achieve a similar outcome by just modifying and cleaning up the diet and focusing on some key points. And then how it relates to exercise is essentially with endurance athletes is a really good example. So the body's only going to store so much glucose. We're going to store 300 approximately in the muscle, 200 in the liver. So we have a limited source of energy, so 2,000 calories. And if we go out and perform an activity and we deplete that within a period of time, let's say 90 minutes, and we don't replenish it, our body can start to shut down. So in a state where we're fat adapted, or we're relying on fat as an energy source, we have a very large source. So it would be almost, let's say 20,000 calories that would be available to us at even a low body fat percentage. So essentially in that endurance type activity where we need to go for a long distance, we can rely on our body to break down the fat as fuel in the form of triglyceride, and we're essentially utilizing the energy in that respect without shutting down or bonking.
Okay, so your body's going to use carbohydrate, fat, or protein. How long before you're able to get the benefits of a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a process. Essentially what we need to do initially is we need to look at depleting the glucose in the body. And the rate in which we do that is going to be relative to the means that we take. For an active individual, we're going to burn through our glycogen stores quicker, especially if we do glycolytic type work, so activity that's going to be relatively continuous at a higher intensity. It'll put us in a state where we're going to burn through that glucose a little bit quicker. Once we've done that, the body's going to want to start to break down ketones. It's going to break down fat as fuel, or we're going to get that exogenously, so through the food that we consume. It's going to take about 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It just depends on the individual. Some people are more primed. Some people don't necessarily have the hardware, or just don't have the enzymes, or don't develop the enzymes necessary. Some people utilize carbohydrate quite well, which doesn't necessarily mean that they need to shift into using this sort of a diet. But to answer the question, it would be 3 to 4 weeks to become keto adapted, where you're going to start to utilize the fuel in the manner in which you intend. Or we're looking at approximately 6 to 8 weeks to be full fat adapted, where our body's going to become proficient at breaking down the fat that we have stored.
So we've become effective at using ketones or fat as energy, and that took about 4 to 6 weeks. And then if I have a carbohydrate, does that reset my whole process? Then I have to become re-fat adapted, or can you have some carbohydrates, or will that just change your body type completely again?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on the individual, and it's going to depend upon the level of activity. But the way to think about it is the body's either going to be using carbohydrate as a source of fuel, or it's going to be using ketones. We're not going to be using both at the same time. So think about it in terms of when blood sugar increases, ketones decrease, and when ketones increase, blood sugar decreases. So they do work in transverse of each other. So if we're focused on adding in a carbohydrate, we can do that strategically. We know that when we train, depending upon what type of training, but generally what happens is that our blood glucose does increase. So even in the absence of carbohydrate, the body still has a magnificent way of making glucose available, and it can do that through the conversion of protein, amino acids, and it can do that through the breakdown of fatty acids. So essentially, if you're a highly active individual, you can use carbohydrate to augment and to enhance your performance within a specific activity if it's going to be glycolytic. And you could perhaps get back into ketosis quite quickly following that. But the overall amount that one can consume and get away with is going to vary from person to person. If we were doing a very long endurance type event, we may be able to consume up to a couple 100 grams of glucose, burn through that, and then post-activity we're going to get back into that state quite quickly. But if we consume an abundance of glucose beyond what we can handle, blood sugar will go up, ketones will go down. It's going to take you to expend that glucose before you're going to elevate the ketones again.
So for my sport, being Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I sweat a lot. I'm always replenishing my salt. So with my food, I'll add like a lot of table salt, Himalayan sea salt. Talk to me about the importance in salt in the diet. Like my theory is, if I'm sweating out water, salt, and sugar, you should be drinking that or replenishing that.
One of the major importance, especially related to the ketogenic diet, is that because we're not holding glucose, or we're not storing glucose, we're holding less water. We're more likely to become dehydrated. And a lot of people, when they get something that people refer to as the keto flu, where they're not feeling great, generally it's also associated with dehydration. So to your point, adding in something like table salt, more so specifically Himalayan salt, like you mentioned, it has a good balance in electrolytes. So a good balance between potassium and sodium, which is what makes Himalayan salt the big go-to. So it's going to help in terms of hydration. That's going to be the key variable. And that's going to allow you to essentially stay hydrated in the absence of glucose and try to avoid some of those problems that are associated with dehydration.